Hello there and welcome to Wednesday in Parliament. Coming up, Theresa May and Jeremy Corbyn battle over health funding and the UK economy, and backbench MPs demand answers on plans for leaving the EU.
Can I suggest to the Prime Minister that having your cake and eating it isn't a serious strategy for Brexit?
MPs reject a call for another inquiry into Tony Blair's handling of Iraq. And the new MP for Witney pays tribute to his predecessor, David Cameron.
He found the Conservative Party bleeding after 3 successive election defeats. He picked it up, restored its faith in itself, and returned it to government.
Yeah.
But first, Prime Minister's Questions last week was the warm-up to the Chancellor Philip Hammond's autumn statement, where he set out his view of the economy. At Prime Minister's Questions this week, Jeremy Corbyn tackled Theresa May over some of those predictions, and she defended the government's record.
The IMF says that this will be the fastest growing advanced economy in the world this year. Unemployment is down, we have record numbers of people in employment, and we have companies like Nissan, Jaguar Land Rover, Honda, Arm, Google, Facebook, Apple investing in the UK, securing jobs here in the United Kingdom. That's what a good economic plan does.
Since she quotes the Institute of Fiscal Studies, I think she's been a little bit selective, because they also went on to say that the prospect for workers over the next 6 years was, and I quote, dreadful, and went on to say, creating, and I quote, the worst decade for living standards since the last war, and probably since the 1920s. Isn't it fair to say that those just getting by are suffering all the pain for no gain?
Prime Minister!
I have to say to the right honourable gentleman, I think given that he can't differentiate between the IMF and the IFS, it's probably a good job he's sitting there and I'm standing here. What are the measures we've been doing? We've increased the national living wage. We introduced the national living wage. We're increasing personal tax allowance, taking more people out of paying tax altogether. We're increasing the number of affordable homes being built. But we can only do this if we have a strong economy, and it's our plan that delivers that strong economy.
In the autumn statement last week, the Chancellor spoke for over 50 minutes. During that time, he didn't once mention the National Health Service or social care. 1.2 million people are lacking the care they need. Why was there not one single penny more for social care in the autumn statement?
Prime Minister!
There is absolutely no doubt that the social care system is under pressure. We recognise that. If you just look at the fact that there are 1 million more people aged over 65 today than there were in 2010, we see the sort of pressures on the social care system. But that's why the government has already acted to put more money into the social care system. More money through the Better Care Fund, 3.5 billion extra through the Better Care Fund, and more money through the social care precept. But it's also important that local authorities and the NHS work together to ensure, for example, that people have the social care they need so they're not ending up blocking beds in hospital. There's some very good practice up and down the country, and sadly there's some not so good practice. What we need to do is make sure everybody is giving the best possible service to people who need it.
Jeremy Corbyn!
There's a tragic parallel going on between an underfunded NHS and an underfunded social care system all over the country. So could the Prime Minister explain to the more than 1 million elderly people not getting the care they need, to the 4 million on NHS waiting lists, to the millions of pensioners worried about losing the protection of the triple lock, why there is not one penny extra for the NHS or social care? Just what is this government's real sense of priorities?
Prime Minister!
The right honourable gentleman talks about funding social care and funding the National Health Service. £3.8 billion extra is going into the National Health Service this year. Under Labour's plans, we would have seen £1.3 billion less going into the National Health Service. Social care funding is going up under this government. At the last last election, the Shadow Chancellor, lately of Strictly fame, said local authorities would get not a penny more. Conservatives putting money into the NHS and social care, Labour would deny it.
Elsewhere, MPs raised Brexit and the photographer's snap of the notes of a Conservative aide, which made the front pages of many newspapers this week.
Can I suggest to the Prime Minister that having your cake and eating it isn't a serious strategy for Brexit, and that Britain deserves better than having to rely on leaked documents to know the government's plans? How on earth can she expect MPs to vote to trigger Article 50 when she refuses to give any clarity as to what kind of Brexit she's pursuing? Will it involve us still being members of the single market? Is it arrogance or is it incompetence?
Prime Minister!
I've answered this question many times in this House, and I can assure the Honourable Lady. She asks specifically about the issue of the single market and trading with the European Union. I've been very clear. We are ambitious in getting the best possible deal for trading with and operating within the single European market.
Well, one MP raised the response of the European Council President Donald Tusk to a letter from 80, mostly Conservative MPs, calling for an early agreement on the rights of British citizens living in EU countries and EU citizens living in the UK. Mr Tusk has been adamant there will be no talks before Article 50 negotiations are formally triggered.
I welcome my right honourable friend's eagerness to give EU citizens living and working lawfully in this country the assurance that they'll be able to remain here after Brexit and to obtain similar reassurances for British citizens living and working in the EU. Does she therefore share my disappointment that Mr Juncker, in response to a letter from 80 members of this House to resolve this issue speedily, has intransigently put EU processes ahead of common humanity?
Well, I can assure my right honourable friend, as I've said earlier, that I would hope that this is an issue that we can look at an early stage of the negotiations. Of course, there will be 2 years of the negotiations. I think it is right that we want to give reassurance to British citizens living in the EU and to EU citizens living here in the UK. But I think the reaction that we've seen shows why it was absolutely right for us not to do what the Labour Party wanted us to do, which was simply to give away the guarantee for rights of EU citizens here in the UK, because as we've seen, that would have left UK citizens in Europe high and dry.
Well, let's stay with Brexit and the economy. The Independent Office for Budget Responsibility, or OBR, produced its forecast for the UK's finances ahead of last week's autumn statement. When its chair appeared in front of the Treasury Committee, MPs wanted to know how it had made its predictions about the economy and investment in the light of Brexit.
Given the uncertainty as to where, for example, we're going to end up on the trade regime, on the migration regime, on other policy choices, and exactly the sort of opportunities taken or not taken that you describe, that would lead some firms to delay or cancel investment. We, I think, give weight to that in part because there's evidence that it's already happening. So if you look at the level of business investment over the first 3 quarters of the year, it's lower than the equivalent period of last year, and it's lower than our forecast was in March. My caveat to that would be that the business investment data are amongst the most volatile and heavily revised from quarter to quarter that you would wish to find. So this will bounce around a lot, but that was basically the thinking underpinning the judgment.
And where do you draw your uncertainty assumptions from?
Well, in partly, the sentiments you get from business indicators, as I say, in particular, the fact that you're already seeing this, to the extent that we can trust the data, showing up. There's anecdotal evidence to a degree as well, but moving from this to a precise mapping of where business investment goes on a quarter-to-quarter basis would be amongst game, but we have to make assumptions.
And when the government gives you policy, you will be able to provide illumination on what might happen?
Yes, well, I think the thing to be wary about there is that negotiation is a two-way street and indeed possibly a multiple-way street. So the government may have very clearly, set out hopes that it may not achieve. So how quickly? I mean, my suspicion is that, in particular, if we are in a negotiation in which nothing very much is agreed until everything is agreed, we could be. I could be retired, you could be in the Lords, much will have passed before we know where we are.
I think you will deserve your period first.
You would agree, wouldn't you, that the crucial moment of most uncertainty is likely to be the consequences of any new arrangements put in place after we arrive in the arrival hall?
Which is your date for the arrival hall?
2019.
2019, yeah. Well, as I say, I think it comes back in part to the degree to which this ends up being a negotiation in which, nothing is agreed until everything is agreed.
Imagine yourself in an aeroplane.
You probably know, you can judge better than I whether things are going to be that much clearer in 2019. I fear possibly not.
Imagine yourself in an aeroplane, you're about to take off, and there's a discussion taking place about where to go. Would your feeling of uncertainty be increased, decreased, or unchanged if, while you were having the conversation, you took off?
I would, the fact that I'd got on an aircraft and people were still discussing where they wanted to go would be a source of sufficient alarm before we started, I think.
You're very good at not answering the question.
Andrew Tyree. You're watching Wednesday in Parliament with me, Alicia McCarthy. Now, MPs have voted down a plan for another inquiry into whether or not the former Prime Minister Tony Blair deceived Parliament in the months prior to the invasion of Iraq in 2003. This summer, the mammoth Chilcot inquiry report concluded that there had been a rush to war without peaceful options being fully considered, and there had been too little planning for the post-invasion period. But in this latest debate on the consequences of the Iraq conflict, a succession of Labour MPs rallied to the defence of the party's former leader and Prime Minister.
On March 2003, when a Prime Minister goes to that dispatch box and tells the House absolutely conclusively a real and present danger exists to the United Kingdom, then it is reasonable, even with those with misgivings, to say the Prime Minister must be seeing something that I'm not seeing. He must know something that I'm not knowing and be misled into the lobby to vote for the conflict. That is the point that I am making.
Even countries which thought we shouldn't go to war, the Russians, the French, the Germans, they all thought he got weapons of mass destruction too. In fact, Saddam Hussein, the only way he was able to enslave the people of Iraq was by leading them to believe he got weapons of mass destruction too.
The case presented to this Parliament was a real and present danger to the United Kingdom that required the abandonment of diplomacy internationally and the immediate process to war.
The Kurds believed prior to 2003 that chemical weapons were going to be used against them again. So it wasn't simply an idea that Tony Blair had in his head. We had a full debate in this Parliament in 2003, and I, amongst others, voted for the action.
But if I say it again to the Labour benches, I'm not really interested in the civil war in the Labour Party. I'm interested in the real war that took place and resulted in the deaths of hundreds of thousands of people. And therefore, it is reasonable and important to consider whether parliamentary accountability can be a major weapon of this House in making sure such events do not happen again.
Does it show my concern that if we do nothing following this 7-year, £10 million inquiry and take no steps towards accountability for the clear evidence that the former Prime Minister was fixing the evidence around the policy to go to war, that it will be almost impossible to begin to restore faith that has been lost in our political system?
And as we've been told, Chilcot at the Liaison Committee made it very clear that Tony Blair had not deceived Parliament. Sadly, I think the only deception is in this motion, and I think its opportunistic nature does not serve this issue or this Parliament well.
If we just turn these post-Chilcot debates into an attempt to pursue and hound Tony Blair, the whole thing just turns into a party political argument with Labour members of Parliament trying to defend the position of their government.
While it's right to learn the lessons identified by the Chilcot report, we should ensure that we avoid learning the wrong ones. As the then Prime Minister said in this House on the day the report was published, it is wrong to conclude that we should not stand with our US allies when our common interest is threatened. It is wrong to conclude that we cannot rely on the judgments of our brilliant and hard-working intelligence agencies.
A Labour MP reminded the debate that 139 of his party's MPs had voted against the war.
But there were 50 others who had grave doubts about the war, and they were, in my view, bribed, bullied, bamboozled into voting the wrong way, and many of them have regretted it very much since that. And they were inducements. Well, the honourable gentleman.
On a point of order, is it in order for a member of this House to allege that other members of this House were bribed, paid to vote a particular way, and should he not produce evidence for it?
But, Madam Deputy Speaker, if we moved on from Iraq now and leave the drawing of lessons from these events for another day, how many more Iraqs, Syrias and Libyas will there be?
We will do ourselves and future governments no favours if we spend even more time in this House and in the committee rooms examining contentions that the Chilcot report and 4 other inquiries at exhaustive length have already found to be incorrect.
And at the end of that debate, MPs voted 439 to 70 against the SNP plan for another parliamentary inquiry. Well, back now to Prime Minister's questions, where the SNP's Westminster leader raised the worsening humanitarian crisis in Syria. Angus Robertson said the situation in Aleppo had been described as possibly one of the biggest massacres of civilians since World War II. Theresa May said there were talks about to take place at the United Nations.
The United Kingdom has been working with France and to bring forward an emergency discussion on this issue at the UN Security Council. That will take place later today. We want to see a cessation of hostilities. We want to see an opportunity for aid, humanitarian aid, to have access to Aleppo, and we will be pressing for that at the Security Council.
Angus Robertson. Speaker, it is extremely welcome that the discussions are taking place in the United Nations, and we wish success to all of those who are supporting a humanitarian solution to the crisis there. However, things are so bad that the agencies are saying that in Aleppo the situation is so bad that it is descending into hell. Time is absolutely of the essence. I know the Prime Minister is seized of this matter. We are in agreement. Please can I appeal to her? Can absolutely everything be done now to alleviate the situation of the poor people of Aleppo and of Syria?
Well, the Right Honourable Gentleman is right about the horrific situation that exists in Aleppo. I can assure him that the government is pressing hard, is doing everything that we can in relation to this. We have consistently looked at what might be the possible solutions to see if there are other avenues that we can press for. I think the Security Council debate is very important, and there's an important message to send to Russia, that they actually use their influence with the Assad regime to stop these appalling atrocities in Aleppo and let humanitarian aid through.
The Work and Pensions Secretary, Damien Green, says benefit sanctions are encouraging people to look for work harder, despite a highly critical report by the spending watchdog. The National Audit Office says that deductions leading to hardship, hunger and depression are being imposed on people despite limited evidence on how well the regime works. The Minister was asked about the report when he appeared in front of the committee that scrutinises his department.
There is quite a lot of evidence from countries around the world with widely different benefit systems which have sanctions, all of which say that they work. And our own evidence.
The Audit Office concluded that you couldn't say that yours worked.
Well,
isn't that the point?
We have asked people who receive benefits, which seems to be quite a powerful piece of research, and 70% of people who receive JSA and 60% of people who receive ESA say that the sanctions regime actually makes them more likely to follow the rules. So that brings me on to the other point that the NAO makes, that you're saving this money and spending this amount of money. You can't say how much money is saved by a sanctions regime precisely because the vast majority of people obey it, and we don't know. It's why we have laws. Most people don't break the law, but nobody says, well, you can't say whether it's worthwhile having a legal system or not. Of course it is, because it's just another encouragement to people to make sure.
Well, are you saying the sanctions regimes are a deterrent measure so that other people won't be tempted to try and defraud the system. Is that what you're saying?
No, that's what the claimants say. That's what 70% of people receiving JSA say, that okay, I know...
So the people who are on the sanctions regime, they just happen to be the unlucky ones who are picked out to demonstrate the deterrent for everybody else.
No, it's also...
No wonder there's so much upset about it.
Well, the vast majority of people who receive a sanction only receive one, which suggests to me, okay, they think that, these people are taking this seriously, so they then comply, and that's great. They can get their benefits. And the other thing, the salient fact, is that both JSA and ESA sanctions have halved since last year, which suggests to me that people... It's the same point, really. People say, OK, this is not just a paper exercise. I will get sanctioned if I don't comply, if I don't look for work hard enough. And then they start doing it to their own benefit, of course, because that gets them into work.
The Work and Pensions Secretary, Damien Green. Well, staying with the benefit system, a peer has highlighted the case of thousands of low-income families with a disabled child who've lost out on thousands of pounds in tax credit payments. The underpayments over 5 years occurred after the Department for Work and Pensions failed to share information about claimants with Her Majesty's Revenue and Customs. Lord Young explained what had happened in some cases.
Claimants were able to claim the higher rate of tax credit, and many did claim it at the time. Although it is the claimant's responsibility to inform HMRC of their eligibility, HMRC's backup practice was to take information from DWP to automatically update awards. Last week, we announced that HMRC would issue lump sum payments to families affected by a breakdown in this backup to cover what they would have got from the 6th of April 2016 and make sure they get their entitlement for the future.
I'm sure he would agree that we're dealing with a major injustice here. 28,000 low-income families with disabled children have lost up to £4,400 a year for 5 years, all because between 2011 and 2014 the DWP omitted the box from the relevant form for people to indicate whether they receive tax credits or not. As the law currently stands, as the Minister has said, the onus is on the claimant to claim what they're entitled to. But, my Lords, the system of tax credits is extremely complicated for anyone to understand. Would the Minister not agree that the law should be changed to place the onus on the revenue to pay claimants what they're entitled to, so long as they provide the right information about their circumstances? And would he give serious consideration to this?
So far as the 28,000 families are concerned, HMRC will be contacting them directly and automatically adjusting their award and making a lump sum payment by the end of January, backdated till April 2016. So far as his suggestion about a future change of the law is concerned, I'm sure that's something that we looked at sympathetically in order to try and streamline the system and to avoid the problems that he's identified in his question.
Lord Young. Finally, for now, David Cameron's successor as Witney MP has paid tribute to the former Prime Minister, saying he made the Conservative Party believe in itself again. Robert Courts used his maiden speech in the Commons to say both the party and the country would forever be in Mr Cameron's debt.
He found the Conservative Party bleeding after 3 successive election defeats. He picked it up, restored its faith in itself, and returned it to government. Mr Speaker, I know firsthand the effect that his leadership had upon the party and on the country and on its fortunes, because I was there on the streets and I felt the turning of the tide. There is perhaps no greater tribute that I could pay David Cameron than to say that he made the Conservative Party believe in itself again. He made it fresh, dynamic and able to communicate with modern Britain. He created a new generation of Conservative politicians, Mr Speaker, and I am one of them.
And he paid tribute to another former MP.
In 1945, Albert Stubbs won the seat of Cambridgeshire for the Labour Party. He was a He was a famous trade unionist, and he won his seat by a majority of 44 by getting out on his motorcycle and riding around the villages of Cambridgeshire and signing up the workers to the union. He was known for his hard work for the people of that area and his interest in rural issues. Now, Mr. Speaker, that record is one that I aspire to when I look at the people of West Oxfordshire. Now, honourable members need not worry. I'm not about to execute the fastest defection in political history. I mention this because Mr. Stubbs was my great-grandfather. Now, I must watch my words carefully at this point, because his daughter, my grandmother, will be watching on the television. If I put a foot out of line, I'm going to get a very strongly worded letter. I do therefore acknowledge at this stage that Mr. Stubbs would be horrified by my politics. But I hope you would at least approve of my work ethic.
And that's it for now, but do join us at the same time tomorrow for another roundup of the best of the day here at Westminster. But until then, from me, Alicia McCarthy, goodbye.